Hello everyone and welcome to the thrilling return of the Young Writers Vlog, first time in the new space, and we're here to continue our talk on the minutia of writing by talking about how to create emphasis. Now, emphasis is one of those things that we use in everyday life, but the way it works and how you're supposed to use it is one of those things that is always vaguely defined. This is in part due to the fact that emphasized statements are defined as emphasized because of their relationship to all of the statements around them. You create emphasis by focusing on one thing at the cost of another thing. For this episode, I'm going to be focusing more on the small-scale emphasis, on the individual words, statements, and fragments of a sentence that you can use and how to create emphasis on those, rather than the long-form emphasis that describes the flow of attention throughout an entire story. We're going to start, of course, with how to create emphasis. At its base, emphasis is very easy to create. It's about making something stand out from everything else. The easiest way to do that is to establish and then immediately break a pattern of speaking. Make a sentence start the same way over and over again. Make it a point of describing the way that the doors look everywhere you go. Make the reader call attention to the fact that you're doing this by doing it over and over again. And then, once the reader has definitely noticed this is happening, stop doing it. If you can set up the reader's expectation that something's going to happen, when you break it, they're going to be paying a lot of attention to the reasons why that pattern was broken. You can also do this by breaking the assumed rules of writing, whether that's a big picture break like inverting a trope of storytelling or character development, or in the small scale of making a sentence work improperly, putting a comma where it's not really supposed to be, or introducing way too many dashes into a sentence. Remember, you are allowed to break the rules if you have a good enough reason. This describes one of the second ways to create emphasis, which is using metatextual aids. Italicizing or bolding a words, typing something in small caps, or using white space can be used to make text stand out from the text around it, but has to be done conservatively. The general rule of emphasis always applies. The more you emphasize, the less you emphasize. And so if you're going to be changing the text on the page to create emphasis, you have to do so as sparingly as possible and only for the best of reasons. Especially if you're doing small caps. It's very risky. Finally, finality inherently creates emphasis. Everything that happens at the end of a list or at the end of a sentence is generally more emphasized than something else. The end of your story creates a lot of emphasis just because it's the end of the story. It is the last thing that your readers are going to interact with, and so it's the thing that's going to stick in their mind the most strongly. So that is, generally speaking, how you create emphasis. Now, more importantly, when do you use emphasis, and why would you use emphasis? It's important to note that your audience isn't going to be given an equal amount of attention to every moment of your work. There are times when your story is going to be less demanding of your audience, whether it's because it's less inherently engaging, or if there's just simply a fewer number of things to pay attention to. So when you're thinking about how emphasis is working in your writing, it's important to split it into two main categories. The parts that are more inherently engaging and more demanding of your audience, and the parts that are more relaxed and less demanding of your audience. Emphasis works differently in each of these circumstances. For the more engaging and demanding parts of your writing, the emphasis is important on making sure the audience notices the things that are most important in this time. When there's 1,000 things to pay attention to, it's important to make sure that if one of those things the audience definitely has to notice, to make sure that they notice it. This is usually caused by slowing down what's happening to focus on one otherwise innocuous thing that might seem a bit out of place given everything that's happened, such as interrupting an intense car chase to focus on a pedestrian crossing the street a couple blocks down. As an audience member, you would immediately notice that and immediately understand the implications of why you're being shown this pedestrian crossing the street. And the reason why they interrupt the action to show you this is because if they try to just do a long shot where there's you looking down the road, you can see a pedestrian about to cross. The audience isn't necessarily going to notice that if there's so much else happening on screen and so many other things to pay attention to. So slowing down the action and focusing on the one thing that the audience needs to know is the best way to emphasize that this is really important. Pay attention. On the other hand, when the pace of your narrative is slower and less demanding of the audience, the best way to create emphasis is to just make something happen suddenly. In audiovisual narratives, it's often accompanied by a sudden change in music or a loud sound that snaps the audience to attention to make them focus on what's happening. You can use a similar strategy to this when you're in the written word. Starting a paragraph with the word bang or slam or some other loud onomatopoeia sound can really make the reader pay attention to the physical things that are happening and can really break them out of the trance of reading through a slower and a less demanding part of the narrative. So no matter what's happening around it, when you're creating emphasis, you're often changing the rhythm or the mood of the narrative itself temporarily in order to signal that this is really important and should be focused on. It's important to remember, of course, that emphasis is a limited resource. Every time you emphasize something, you lose your ability to emphasize something else. You can't go from emphasizing something to immediately emphasizing another thing to immediately emphasizing another thing, because that's just listing things off, and the reader's going to not pay attention to any of it very quickly. So because emphasis is such a limited resource, it's important to pay attention to how the natural flows of intensity in your story are creating this emphasis. Because emphasis is such a limited resource, you want to make use of it as best as you can and not waste it by emphasizing things accidentally. So thank you for joining me on this episode of the Young Writers Vlog here at the new location. Make sure to check out next episode where I talk about word choice and saying exactly what you mean so that everyone knows exactly what you mean. Something that I feel very strongly about, despite the fact that when speaking I do the exact opposite of that. That's why I have such strong feelings about it, because I don't do it.